By the time my mother died, my sister had already taken almost everything that mattered, which is why her smile at the beginning of the will reading made perfect sense to everyone in the room except me. She had taken the house in practice long before any lawyer was involved. She had taken control of my mother's medications, appointments, calls, visitors, and mail. She had taken the role of devoted daughter so completely that even people who had known us our whole lives started speaking to me with that careful, pitying tone reserved for the child who wasn't there enough. She had even taken my mother's final months and turned them into a story where she was the faithful one, the sacrificial one, the daughter who stayed. So when we all sat down in that dark wood office, and the lawyer began reading through jewelry, bank accounts, furniture, and family keepsakes, my sister wore the expression of a woman who had already counted the money and was only waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The problem was that my mother had known exactly what kind of woman my sister was. And unlike the rest of us, she had left room for an ending. If you're watching, tell me where you're from and stay with me, because this story doesn't get interesting when my mother dies. It gets interesting when my sister realizes my mother was paying attention the whole time. My sister Evelyn is 3 years older than I am, and if you had met us in public at almost any point in our lives, you probably would have believed the story she preferred people to believe. She was polished, social, composed, and naturally gifted at making concern sound like kindness, even when it was really control. I was quieter, more private, slower to speak when a room was full, and never particularly interested in competing with someone who seemed to enjoy being watched. When we were young, adults called her confident and called me sensitive, and that sounds harmless until you live long enough to notice how often those labels become instructions. Confident girls are allowed to take up space. Sensitive girls are expected to make room. By the time we were adults, that imbalance had calcified into family tradition. Evelyn made announcements. I made adjustments. She made scenes that somehow became other people's responsibilities. I swallowed discomfort, because everyone was always so tired from managing her that there seemed to be no energy left for my side of anything. My mother, Lorraine, loved us both. I need to say that clearly because stories about siblings and inheritance get flattened into simple categories too easily. My mother did love us both, but love and clarity are not the same thing, and by the last years of her life, she had far more of the second than the first. She knew Evelyn could charm a room in under 2 minutes and poison it 5 minutes later if she needed to. She knew I was easier to overlook because I disliked making emotional messes in public. She knew which daughter called because she wanted to know how my mother was feeling, and which one called because she wanted to know who had visited, what had been said, and whether any decisions had been made without her. My mother knew all of that, but for a long time she still believed the family would somehow regulate itself through habit and decency. People from her generation often believe that. They trust blood to restrain behavior that would disgust them in strangers. Then my father died, and whatever balance still existed disappeared with him. He had been the one person Evelyn never fully overpowered, not because he was domineering, because he saw her clearly and refused to reward theatrics. If she complained loudly enough for the room to tilt toward her, he would look at her once and say, "Use your real voice or say nothing." I loved him for that more than I knew at the time. After he was gone, the atmosphere around my mother changed almost immediately. Evelyn started appearing more often, then staying longer, then speaking for my mother when no one had asked her to. She began helping with bills, with groceries, with medication, with rides to appointments. On paper, it looked admirable. In practice, it was annexation. My mother still lived in her own house, but the rhythm of the place began shifting around Evelyn's preferences. New locks, different routines, a cleaner who reported to Evelyn, a calendar only Evelyn seemed to fully understand. If I called and my mother didn't answer, Evelyn would text me later and say things like, "Mom's exhausted, I told her to rest," or, "Today wasn't a good day, don't upset her with too many questions." She never forbade me. She just interpreted access for me until I began sounding unreasonable if I pushed. At first, I told myself I was being uncharitable because grief changes people. My father's death hit all of us differently. Maybe Evelyn was over-functioning because it was the only way she knew how to survive. Maybe her bossiness came from fear. Maybe her constant updates and interventions were clumsy forms of love. That's the trap with people like her. They rarely begin with one act ugly enough to force a clean response. They begin by becoming indispensable while slowly making everyone else feel less competent, less informed, or less necessary. By the time you realize they are not helping but consolidating, the social story is already on their side. The first time I understood something more deliberate was happening was over my mother's mail. I had stopped by one Tuesday afternoon with soup and fresh bread from the bakery she liked. My mother was in the sitting room half asleep in her chair, and a stack of unopened envelopes sat on the side table. I picked one up without thinking because it had a handwritten return address from an old cousin in Maryland, and before I could even turn it over, Evelyn walked in from the kitchen and said, "I've got that." Not, "Let me help." Not, "Mom wants me to sort those." Just, "I've got that," in the tone of a woman speaking to someone who had reached into her own purse without permission. I looked at her, still holding the envelope, and she smiled too quickly and said, "Mom gets overwhelmed now. I'm filtering the useless stuff." Filtering. That word sat in my body badly. I asked my mother if she wanted me to open the letter for her. Evelyn answered before she could. "She's tired." My mother opened her eyes, looked at both of us, and said very softly, "You can leave it, Anna." That was the first time I noticed fear in her deference. Not terror. Not abuse in some dramatic television sense. Just the fatigue of a woman who knows every decision now comes with another conversation she does not have strength for. I began visiting at odd times after that. Not to catch anyone in some theatrical wrongdoing, but because I wanted to see the house when Evelyn wasn't prepared for me. It didn't work often. Somehow she was almost always there or arrived within minutes. Once, when I showed up before 10 in the morning on a Saturday, I found her in my mother's bedroom with a jewelry case open on the bed. She laughed and said she was helping Mom organize things before they got too hard to manage later. Another time, I found a notepad in the kitchen with what looked like medication times written alongside names of relatives, neighbors, and church friends, with tiny check marks beside some and arrows beside others. When I asked what it was, Evelyn said, "Just keeping track of who actually shows up." That line was so pointed I felt it like a slap. Then came the gradual social turn, which was almost more damaging than anything happening inside the house. Family friends started telling me how lucky my mother was to have Evelyn handling everything. My Aunt Judith asked, in this perfectly sweet, poisonous tone, whether I felt guilty living 40 minutes away when Evelyn was doing so much of the hands-on work. At church one Sunday, one of my mother's old neighbors touched my arm and said, "Your sister has really stepped up. Your mother seems much calmer with her around." That sentence stunned me because calm was not the word I would have used for the house at all. Controlled, yes. Quiet in the wrong way, yes. But calm? No. Then I understood. Evelyn wasn't only managing my mother. She was narrating her to everyone around us. She was narrating me too. If there is one thing my sister has always understood, it is how to win a situation before the facts arrive. She never waited for people to ask what was happening. She fed them a version early, gently, and with just enough concern that it felt like context rather than influence. Anna means well, but she's never been comfortable around illness. Anna gets emotional, and Mom can't handle too much upset right now. Anna is wonderful, she just has a hard time with this kind of responsibility. Imagine hearing those lines refracted back at you for months through different mouths. Imagine trying to object without sounding exactly like the difficult younger sister she had already prepared them to expect. That is how theft works when it happens in families. Not all at once, and not only through money. First, someone steals the authority to describe reality. The final year of my mother's life was when the house itself started changing. My father had left it entirely to her, along with some savings, a modest investment account, and a collection of old watches and tools he insisted were worth more sentiment than cash. It was not a grand estate, but it was a good house in a town where good houses were becoming scarce. Wide porch, mature maples, stained glass panel beside the front door, built-in shelves my father had installed himself, and a kitchen with the sort of yellow afternoon light that makes ordinary tea feel like memory. Evelyn had always wanted it, not because she loved it more, because she believed it represented status she had somehow earned by force of personality. Even when we were younger, she would joke that one day she'd end up with the house because I'm the one who can actually use it properly. People laughed. I didn't. I knew what she meant by properly. She meant publicly. My mother began asking me strange little questions in those last months, not directly about Evelyn, but around her. Do you still have the spare key I gave you years ago? If you needed to find your father's old paperwork, where would you look first? Do you remember what your father always said about promises signed under pressure? At the time, I thought she was drifting, stitching old concerns into present conversations the way some elderly people do when their minds tire. Now I know she was testing what I still knew and what Evelyn had not yet managed to reorganize around herself. Once, while Evelyn was outside taking a call, my mother grabbed my wrist with surprising force and said, "When the time comes, don't let her explain me." Then she released me and closed her eyes before I could answer. That sentence came back to me later with such force it made me nauseous. I wish I could say I fought harder in those months. I fought some. Not enough. That's one of the ugliest truths of adulthood. Sometimes your deepest regret is not that you abandoned someone, but that you kept waiting for a situation to become obvious enough to justify being louder. I kept thinking there would be a clean moment, a line crossed so visibly that no one could ask me to remain civil. But family cruelty, especially among older people who still care very much about appearances, rarely gives you a clean line. It gives you layers. By the time my mother was hospitalized the final time, Evelyn was already speaking to nurses as though she were a co-authority. She corrected medication histories, answered questions my mother should have answered herself, and once actually told a resident, "She gets confused and then gets embarrassed, so it's better if I handle most of it." I stepped in that time. I said, "No, it's better if you ask my mother directly." Evelyn looked at me with that soft, pitying smile she used when she wanted other people to see me as unreasonable, and said, "Anna, please, not every moment has to become a performance." Even then, in the hospital corridor with my mother 10 feet away, and getting weaker by the day, my own anger was somehow turned into the impolite thing in the room. The day my mother died, Evelyn called me 23 minutes after she was gone. I know the number because I checked later and because numbers can feel obscene when emotion is involved. 23 minutes. Not immediately, not before the paperwork, not after some long, shocked stillness. 23 minutes. Her voice on the phone was breaking in the right places, but not from grief, from strain, administrative strain. She told me Mom had gone peacefully. She told me there was a lot to manage. She told me I should come straight to the house because there are some things we need to sort. Not mourn, sort. By the time I arrived, 2 of my mother's friends from church were already in the kitchen making sandwiches no one would remember eating, and Evelyn had positioned herself exactly where grief is most visible to incoming people. At the table, hand around a mug, shoulders collapsed just enough to invite tenderness. She hugged me and held on 1 second too long, the way she always did when she wanted the room to register generosity. Then she said, quietly but audibly enough, "I did everything I could." I remember thinking, there it is, the thesis statement. Before the body is even cold, the moral of the story is already being installed. The next week moved the way death weeks always move. Casseroles, forms, flowers, cousins who suddenly become experts in what the deceased would have wanted. And the strange, brutal intimacy of sorting clothing while still hearing a person's voice in your head. Evelyn took charge of everything, the obituary wording, the church service, which hymns, which photos, which relatives were told first. If I objected, she folded my objection into the narrative she had already built. I was grieving badly. I was overwhelmed. I wasn't thinking clearly. She said those things with such practiced sorrow that even I began sounding harsh to myself. Once, when I asked why some of my mother's papers had already been removed from the desk in the den, she said, "I'm trying to protect you from the uglier details." Protect me from my own mother's paperwork in my father's house. Then came the first thing she took openly, my mother's pearl earrings, not the expensive pieces. The sentimental ones my father had given her on their 25th anniversary, small enough to look tasteful and old enough to feel like family. I saw them on Evelyn at lunch after the funeral. She noticed me noticing them and said, "Mom always said I had the right coloring for these." Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. That almost no longer matters. What mattered was the timing, the speed. The assumption that anything associated with my mother now passed naturally through Evelyn's body before anyone could question it. I said, "That was quick." She smiled and answered, "Some things shouldn't sit in drawers wasting away." That was when I understood she had already begun spending what she believed she had inherited, even before the law had confirmed a thing. The lawyer's office was scheduled for the following Thursday. Family will readings are never as theatrical in real life as they are in movies, which is why what happened that day remains so vivid. There was nothing dramatic about the room itself. Dark wood, bookshelves, muted carpet, filtered afternoon light, one framed landscape that no one noticed because grief makes all Dacre look vaguely guilty. Present were Evelyn and me, our mother's longtime attorney, Mr. Kessler, my Aunt Judith because Evelyn insisted a family witness was wise, and Judith's son because he drove her and then somehow remained in the room out of what he later called awkwardness. Evelyn arrived in cream wool and a careful shade of lipstick that suggested she intended to be seen as composed, not greedy. She hugged me in the lobby and whispered, "Let's try to get through this without upsetting each other." That line still amazes me. As if harmony were the inheritance she most feared losing. The reading began simply enough. Some money to church charities, a donation to the local library in my father's name, specific furniture pieces allocated to old friends, jewelry divided in ways that mostly matched what I expected, a few savings accounts split evenly, my father's watches to me, my mother's china to Evelyn, the sort of measured distribution that allows everyone in the room to nod and believe the dead remained reasonable to the end. Evelyn relaxed visibly as the pages turned. She even smiled once when the house had not yet been mentioned by page 4. I think she believed my mother had either left it directly to her or arranged some graceful co-ownership that Evelyn could later pressure into sale or surrender. She had that expression she used whenever she thought reality was finally catching up to her entitlement. Then Mr. Kessler paused. It was the kind of pause lawyers make when they are about to move from items to consequences. He folded one page under another, removed a separate document from the back of the packet, adjusted his glasses, and said, "There is one final personal statement and attached codicil your mother asked me to reserve until the end." The room changed then, though quietly. Evelyn's smile didn't vanish immediately. It narrowed. Aunt Judith leaned forward. I felt something low and cold start moving through me because I remembered my mother's hand on my wrist in the hospital and the words she had said. "Don't let her explain me." Mr. Kessler began reading. The statement was addressed to my daughters, though one of you will understand it first. That sentence alone was enough to make Evelyn stop smiling. My mother wrote that she had spent her final years learning a painful lesson about dependence, not her own, but other people's dependence on control. She wrote that illness reveals character more ruthlessly than prosperity ever can. She wrote that one daughter had sat with her and one had managed her, and while the world often mistakes management for devotion, she had not. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my throat. Evelyn shifted in her seat and said, "What is this?" Mr. Kessler did not answer. He kept reading. My mother wrote that in the last year of her life she had become aware that certain visitors were turned away. Certain calls were not always delivered. Certain financial statements reached her late, and certain decisions were being framed as settled before she had agreed to them. She wrote that she was old, not stupid, tired, not absent, and that if anyone in the room had relied on her fatigue to secure a future she had not promised, that reliance had been misplaced. Aunt Judith actually inhaled sharply at that point, a tiny sound, but in a quiet office it was thunder. Then came the codicil. The house, my father's house, was not being left to Evelyn. It was being placed in a trust under my name, with immediate instructions that it could not be sold, encumbered, transferred, or occupied by anyone other than me for a period of 10 years, unless I chose otherwise. Alongside that, my mother had included notarized supplementary statements regarding unauthorized handling of her mail, attempted interference with her communications, and pressure related to property decisions during her final illness. She had not accused anyone of a crime directly. My mother was too careful for that. What she had done was worse for Evelyn. She had created a legal structure that treated my sister like exactly the kind of risk she was. Evelyn said, "This is ridiculous," before Mr. Kessler even finished. Her voice didn't rise much, but something old and ugly finally showed through the polish. She was sick. She was confused. Anna has clearly influenced this. There it was, immediate and perfect. If my mother's words favored me, they must have been planted there by me. Mr. Kessler looked at her in a way I have only ever seen older lawyers look at people who do not yet understand how much damage they are doing themselves by speaking. Then he said, "Your mother prepared the codicil 18 months ago and reconfirmed it twice, including once privately and once with medical competency documentation attached." That was the first real blow. Not just that my mother had protected the house, that she had done it before the final steep decline, before Evelyn could claim confusion, before any of us knew how much would be needed. Then Mr. Kessler read the last paragraph. My mother wrote that the contents of a sealed envelope in his possession were to be handed to me alone after the reading if, and only if, anyone disputed her competence, motives, or freedom in making these decisions. Evelyn opened her mouth again before she realized what she was doing and said, "Of course I dispute them." That sentence cost her more than anything else she could have said, because once she challenged the will, the envelope became active by my mother's own instruction. Mr. Kessler nodded once, not happily, not dramatically, just with the resigned professionalism of a man watching a trap close exactly when it was designed to. The envelope contained copies of notes my mother had dictated privately to him over several meetings, plus dates, details, and corroborating observations about Evelyn's management of the household during the last year. Missed deliveries, withheld messages, a specific incident involving a bank statement being opened before it reached my mother's hands. Pressure about making things easier by putting the house in Evelyn's name before death. There was even a handwritten page from my mother herself, shaky but unmistakably hers, saying, "If Evelyn is angry when this is read, believe the anger. It will tell you more truth than her kindness ever did." I cannot fully describe the expression on my sister's face at that moment because it changed too quickly and too completely to stay one thing. Shock first, then outrage, then something almost more humiliating than either, recognition. She understood all at once that my mother had not been passive, had not been fooled, and had not died before answering her. The woman Evelyn thought she had outmaneuvered had spent her final strength making sure the last public version of the story would not belong to her. My Aunt Judith tried to step in then with the usual family nonsense, saying emotions were high and perhaps everyone needed time. But the problem with that old family reflex is that once documents exist, time usually means time to soften the truth until it can be lived with. I had no interest in that. Not anymore. For the first time in my entire life, I did not lower myself to keep Evelyn from becoming uncomfortable. I asked Mr. Kessler, very clearly, what legal remedies were available if there had been interference with my mother's communications or property-related pressure during her final illness. Aunt Judith looked appalled. Evelyn looked furious. Mr. Kessler looked, if I'm honest, slightly relieved. He answered me just as clearly. And that was the moment the room stopped belonging to my sister. Because for the first time, she was not just dealing with family memory, family politics, or family exhaustion. She was dealing with paper, dates, law, and the public collapse of a role she had curated for years. The devoted daughter, the responsible one, the one who stayed. My mother had not only denied her the house, she had denied her the moral victory she wanted to wear while taking it. What followed over the next month was uglier, quieter, and much more satisfying than one dramatic shouting match could ever have been. Evelyn called everyone. Of course she did. She tried to frame the will as the result of my manipulation, of old resentments, of late-life paranoia. My mother apparently developed only in ways that harmed Evelyn's interests. But once someone spends years narrating reality for others, the day their control breaks is catastrophic because people start re-examining everything backward. The cousins remembered how hard it had become to speak to my mother directly. Aunt Judith remembered being told not to tire Lorraine with visits. A church friend quietly admitted that 2 of her phone messages had never been returned, and she had assumed my mother was too weak to call back. One by one, small things that had felt unfortunate on their own began fitting together. The real revenge, though, did not come from gossip. It came from procedure. Because my mother had been so careful, Evelyn's anger forced the very mechanisms that exposed her more fully. Her challenge activated disclosures. Her complaints triggered reviews. Her insistence that she had only been helping made people examine what help had looked like in practice. She tried to contest the house provision, which meant her own behavior was pulled into formal scrutiny. She didn't lose just because my mother loved me more or because fate favored me in some sentimental way. She lost because her arrogance made her believe no one older, weaker, or quieter than she was could possibly be documenting her. I moved into the house 3 weeks later. Not because I wanted to sit in grief like a museum curator, but because I understood what my mother had really given me. Not just property, position. She had finally refused to let Evelyn tell the story. That mattered more than the real estate itself. For years, my sister had been converting presence into power and interpretation into ownership. My mother's final act was to cut that equation apart in front of witnesses and signatures. She left me the one thing Evelyn had spent a lifetime assuming would naturally become hers, because she wanted it more loudly. The first night I slept there alone, I stood in my father's den with one of his old watches in my hand and looked around at the built-in shelves, the lamp by the chair where he used to read, the window over the garden my mother loved, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Not triumph exactly. Restoration. The house was still sad. Grief still sat in it, but it was mine in a way deeper than legal language. It was no longer available to be narrated away from me by the person who had always counted on my silence to finish what her ambitions started. A month later, Evelyn sent me a letter. Not an email, not a text, not a voicemail she could later deny the tone of. A letter. 6 pages. The usual shape: hurt, grievance, revision, tears. She said she had sacrificed more than anyone knew. She said our mother had been confused and vulnerable. She said I had always been jealous of her ease with people and was now using legal technicalities to punish her. And buried in the 4th page was the sentence that made me laugh aloud in my own kitchen. You always get protected when people start looking closely. That was the first honest thing she had written in her life. Because yes, that's what happened this time. The difference is that for once, the person protecting me was the woman Evelyn thought she had already outlasted. I never answered the letter. That was its own kind of revenge. Evelyn has lived her entire life on response. Attention, resistance, explanation, defense, pleading, negotiation. She needs movement from other people to keep her sense of power alive. Silence from me had once been useful to her because it left her room to define me. Silence from me after the will was something else entirely. It meant I no longer needed her understanding, her approval, or even her version of events in order to stand where I was standing. I had documents. I had the house. I had the last page. And most importantly, I had my mother's final refusal to let herself be explained by the wrong daughter. If you've ever lived in a family where one person seems to dominate every room without ever sounding obviously cruel, let me say this clearly. The most dangerous people are often the ones everyone else experiences as helpful, because their control arrives disguised as efficiency. They answer before others can speak. They carry things no one asked them to carry. They filter, interpret, soften, translate, manage, and gradually make themselves the bridge to reality. Then one day you realize they've been charging tolls the whole time. My sister thought she had already won before the lawyer opened the file. That's why her smile at the beginning of the reading still feels so important to me. It was the smile of a woman who believed fatigue had beaten truth. The smile of someone who thought a dying mother could be managed the same way a family could. The smile of someone who had forgotten that quiet people sometimes spend a very long time noticing before they act. My mother noticed. And in the end, she answered her. If you want more stories like this, watch the next video on screen. It begins with a letter from a man who vanished decades earlier, and what he finally confesses changes everything.